Hello students, you're welcome to history class. Today we'll be considering the topic British conquest of Nigerian territories. Again, British conquest of Nigerian territories. Now, the various towns that make up the present-day Nigeria were independent territories that had their own system of government before the coming of the British. The British came as explorers, traders, and Christian missionaries. But when they got to these territories, they conquered them and merged them to become a nation called Nigeria, And you remember the amalgamation as well as the different activities of explorers as well as traders and Christian missionaries. Initially, we had the Portuguese who engaged in voyages of discovery before the British now took over from where the Portuguese stopped. Now, the conquest of Nigeria by the British was not by accident. And based on this fact, we know that it was much more like a premeditated event. Now, Nigerian territories were attractive. Why were Nigerian territories attractive? Basically, the natural resources. And based on these natural resources, and most importantly, human resource, the British began to look at the prospects of economic and political gains that they would get. Also, the idea of conquering and colonizing territories in different parts of the world was common as at the time under review, most especially to the British. Now, apart from Nigeria, many other nations of the world were conquered and colonized by Britain at one time or the other. For example, just to name a few, we have nations that were colonized by Britain, which later got their independence. Some of them are America. Interestingly, you might wonder, how was that possible for America to have been colonized by the British? If you remember the history of the American War of Independence, the War of Independence was fought against the British. The British occupied America. Most of the people that make up present-day America migrated into that, not to mention the significant fact that we had the Aborigines, who were the Red Indians, that were displaced. And that's the history of Thanksgiving. The culture of Thanksgiving in America actually stemmed from that, but that's another topic for another day. Another country worthy of mention is Afghanistan. Afghanistan was also colonized by the British. Another is Canada. We also have Jamaica, Malaysia, New Zealand, Egypt in Africa, and Libya as well as our West African neighbor, which is Ghana. And if you look down South Africa, we talk of South Africa. Now, these are a few nations that were colonized and eventually got their independence from Britain at some point in time. Historically, you remember that Ghana had their independence in 1959, while Nigeria had theirs a year later, which was 1960, precisely October 1st. Now, hence, the conquest of Nigeria by the British was well planned and gradually carried out. As you also know that when it comes to the act of occupation, it takes a lot of tactics, it takes a lot of planning. And this started in 1861 when Britain annexed Lagos. An annexation of Lagos means that it became a possession and part of Britain. Now, in 1862, Lagos was declared a colony of Britain. As I've previously taught you about the centuries, 1862 meant that was the 19th century. After the British moved into the interior parts and conquered Yoruba land, moved to northern parts as well as Benin Kingdom, most importantly, it was very, very challenging conquering the eastern parts of Nigeria. And if you remember, when we talked about centralized and non-centralized states, these were the previously existing structures that the British considered to be inferior to their own form of civilization. If Africa, most importantly Nigeria, jogged at their own pace of development, we would have had a different output as opposed to what we have today. And interestingly, today we still have what we call neo-colonialism, which is a modern form of colonization. We are still tied to the apron strings of the British, whether you like to admit it or not. Now, we move on to a subtopic: strategies used by the British to conquer Nigerian territories. There were some strategies that were used by the British to conquer Nigeria. And we'll be considering two major ones: signing of treaties, and the second is waging of war. Now, what can we define as strategy? Now, strategies refers to the method used to achieve a particular desire. Is a method used to achieve a particular desire. The British used both the peaceful and violent methods to conquer Nigerian territories. Most importantly, now we consider the signing of treaties. Number one, signing of treaties. Treaties can be defined as a written agreement between two people or groups of people, and signing of treaties was a peaceful, I repeat, a peaceful method used by the British to conquer Nigerian territories. And it can also be explained further to mean that the British government attempted to get the support or cooperation of African or Nigerian as well as indigenous rulers to open up their territories for colonial rule. Now, trading firms, companies, as well as officials of British government established friendly relationships and held meetings with Nigerian chiefs and local leaders. Now, the purpose of this was to make the chiefs to sign protective treaty with them. Now, the chiefs were made to understand that the protective treaty was to guarantee protection for the local citizens and enable the British to watch over them. You might wonder who would be the ones to attack these locals, and the British that were offering superior protection. But it had a lot to do with the tactics that was used, or matter of fact, the strategies that were used. Now, in 1884, still in the 19th century, the Shekiri ignorantly signed protection treaty with the British, and you'll see the reason why it was ignorantly done. Also, in 1851, the Oba of Lagos, that's Oba Akintoye of Lagos, signed a treaty with the British which led to the annexation of Lagos in 1861. The popular and famous King Jaja of Opobo was forced in 1884 to sign treaties with representatives of the British government. Ijebu and Ekiti also followed suit in 1886, and the British used this as an excuse to wage war later in 1892, because as long as these treaties were signed ignorantly, at some point some of the local chiefs as well as the leaders at that time woke up, but it was rather too late, so they had to go face to face with the British, who had superior firepower and easily just crumbled every opposition like cookies. Now we move on to the second one, which is waging of war. At some point when you are trying to use tactics to defeat or dispel your enemies, and the treaties obviously did not work out fine, they had to step it up the notch, and that went into waging of war. That was full confrontation. Now, waging of war. Warfare was a violent and forceful means used by the British to conquer Nigerian territories. The British carried out many military attacks, and this helped them to extend their commercial and political influence in places where the chiefs or the local people opposed British conquest and domination. Now, military force was used to conquer such territories, and it was easy for the British to conquer by force because they obviously had superior weapons and firepower than the local people. Most importantly, there was the group called Ekumeku in the eastern part of Nigeria. They tried their best at some point to fight the British, but over time the superior firepower was no match for them, as opposed to fighting the British. In order to gain full control of Nigerian territories, the British government set up what we call the Royal West Frontier Force, that's RWAFF, which was used to fight and conquer the Emirate of Nupe and Ilorin in northern Nigeria. You remember that the occupation of the north, especially with Usman Dan Fodio, talking about the maximization of that territory in terms of Islam and the Muslim domination. In the same way, Benin and Akassa were conquered in 1887. Also, we go back to 1851 when the British military personnel attacked King Kosoko of Lagos and expelled him because he did not cooperate with them. Imagine an expulsion of an indigenous Oba, an indigenous king, by an external force. Whatever happened to non-interference in internal affairs? But obviously, you see the reason why Britain eventually called themselves Great Britain, for so many reasons, and most importantly for the fact that they were colonial masters. And you saw that the tactics that were used as opposed to the French was the indirect rule. So in 1892, when the Ijebu Kingdom did not allow the missionaries and British traders to operate in their territory, the British government sent over 1,000 soldiers to attack Benin, but were driven away. But later they came back fully and occupied that territory, destroying, burning and looting many of Benin bronzes. If you remember your Nok culture very well, which you must have been taken in the previous class, Benin bronzes were taken to Britain and ended up in museums. Just last year, France also returned a couple of artifacts that were stolen from Nigeria. So lots of these colonial masters actually looted majority of the heritage that we had in Nigeria. And it was easy for the British, obviously, to conquer Nigeria through war because of their professional military might and tactics. And by 1900, which was the beginning of the 20th century, the colonization of Nigerian territory was completed. At that point, there was no guessing whether Nigeria was going to be a French colonized country. It was already dominated by the British. We understand that from the perspective of from the River Niger and River Benue. At some point, the French thought they could actually have access channel through these rivers, but obviously the British already had occupied lots of territories by force. That was the most effective way for them to occupy Nigeria. And with that, we've come to the end of yet another class, and the topic was British conquest of Nigerian territories, and I went to highlight the strategies which had to do with number one, signing of treaties, and number two, waging of war. Until we meet next week, stay informed in order to avoid being deformed. Thank you and God bless.